Hey everyone, it's Daniel. In the last few videos, we covered some of the most popular math topics that appear on the SAT and ACT. Let's shift gears now and talk about one of the most popular grammar topics that you will see on both tests: how to use a comma. This is worth a lot of points. The reason why is that commas are versatile. They can be used in many ways. So in this video, let's talk about all of the ways that the SAT and ACT will test comma usage. If you find this video helpful, please hit the like button, share, and subscribe. You could also leave a comment down below with any questions you have, or requests for other grammar topics that you'd like me to cover in the future. And be sure to hit the notification bell. That way you can be notified whenever I post a new video. I really appreciate your support. Thank you. Here we go. Before we begin, let's look at a few situations where you don't want to use a comma. Let's look at a question. Cromwell sought to outlaw music during the Puritan Revolution. As a result, many artists left the country in the 1660s. You can press pause and try to answer. On a question like this, the thing you need to ask is whether or not you have full thoughts. So let's read the first part, just up until the comma. Cromwell sought to outlaw music during the Puritan Revolution. That's a full thought. Let's check out the second part now. As a result, many artists left the country in the 1660s. That's also a full thought. This has two full thoughts separated by a comma. That is called a comma splice. You're not allowed to use a comma that way. But you are allowed to use a semicolon that way. The answer is choice C. That gives a semicolon between two full thoughts. Now you might be asking why that semicolon in B is wrong. Look at that word and in choice B. That and makes the second part no longer a full thought. That's why the answer is C and not B. So this brings up an important rule of punctuation. You can use a comma between one full thought and one not full thought, and you could use a semicolon between two full thoughts. Now, just an extra note on that first point, that full and not full thought can be in either order. Full, not full, or not full and full. Either of those with a comma is fine. And there are many other variations of when not to use a comma. Here are a few other examples. I'll exaggerate the pause here so you can really hear each of them. I walk to the store. My friend and I walk to the store. I walk to the large store. Your ear is probably telling you that these commas just sound bad. But let's get technical for a moment. Let's talk about the actual reason why. In the first one, the comma is being used to separate a subject from its verb. In other words, the noun and the action it does. In the second one, the comma is separating a compound subject, or two nouns doing the action. And in the third one, the comma is being used to separate an adjective from the noun that it modifies. Now, if all of that just sounded like gobbledygook to you, that's totally fine. Forget everything I just said. You can just get away with saying that the comma ruins the flow. That's all you need to know. This will help on some other variations as well. For example, I walked to the store. I walked to the store. I could get technical and say things like, don't put a comma between a verb and its preposition, or don't put a comma in the middle of a prepositional phrase, but we really don't need to make things that complicated. Your ear should just tell you that these commas sound terrible. And that's it. And this brings us to a very simple but effective summary about how to use a comma. For comma usage, trust your ear. When you see a comma, exaggerate the pause. If that pause makes sense, then the comma is fine. But if it ruins the flow, then the comma is bad. Many questions are just as simple as that. But now it gets a little harder. Read these upcoming sentences carefully. Think about if you would put a comma between the two underlined words. I decided to order a healthy Greek salad for dinner. The green laundromat offered a clean, sustainable alternative to the dry cleaner. Press pause for a moment and think about it. These sentences look similar because they both follow the construction of adjective, adjective, noun. But they come with an important difference. Let's look at the first one. I decided to order a healthy Greek salad for dinner. Think about those adjectives. Healthy Greek salad. The word healthy has to be describing Greek salad. Let's see if we could switch the order of those adjectives. I wanted to order a Greek healthy salad. That wouldn't make sense. It has to say healthy Greek salad. So if you have two adjectives that have to be in a certain order, that means that you can't put a comma between them. The first one would not get a comma. But let's think about the second one. To say it was a clean, sustainable alternative is fine. But let's try to switch it. It offered a sustainable, clean alternative. Also fine. Those adjectives can be flipped. That means that you can put a comma between them. So here's the rule. If two adjectives must appear in a certain order, then you do not use a comma to separate them. If two adjectives can be flipped, then you do use a comma to separate them. These are called coordinate adjectives. Let's see how this looks on a question. When the warm spring air hits your face, you know it is time for baseball season. Press pause, give it a shot. Again, the question you want to ask is if the adjectives can be flipped. Let's try. It makes perfect sense to say the warm spring air, but can we say the spring warm air? No, it's spring air. It just happens to be warm spring air. Those adjectives have to be in that order. That means that you can't separate them with a comma. The answer is H. This rule comes up on the test quite a bit. Okay, now we're warmed up. Now let's talk about the most popular way that a comma is tested on both the SAT and the ACT. Here are 3 sentences where the comma is being used correctly. Think about why the comma is being used correctly in each sentence. When ordering takeout, I am always sure to include sesame chicken. Why was that comma correct? It was separating a not essential part of the sentence with the full sentence. We don't need when ordering takeout. It's just a little intro. The main part of the sentence is the second part. Let's look at another variation where a comma is being used correctly. One of my favorite dishes is sesame chicken, which is always delicious. Again, that comma is correct. The reason why, it is separating not essential information. But now, it's the second part of the sentence that we don't need. We don't need that little chunk, which is always delicious. It's just a little throwaway. And here's a third variation of when a comma is correct. Sesame chicken, with its crispy texture, is one of my favorite dishes. Again, we are separating not essential information, but now it's the middle portion of the sentence we don't need. We don't need with its crispy texture. And let's prove it. I'll read the sentence without it. Sesame chicken is one of my favorite dishes. That's totally fine. This brings up a very popular rule on both exams. You can use a comma to separate any information that is not essential. And notice, this could be a chunk at the beginning, a chunk at the end, or a chunk in the middle. It's this third variation that's the most popular, especially on the ACT. Let's see how it comes up on a question. Hybrid cars, which were once a novelty, now make up a significant share of the automotive market. Press pause, give it a shot. Again, the main thing you want to ask is if we have a chunk of words that we don't need. Yes, we don't need that little chunk, which were once a novelty. That's a little extra description about hybrid cars, but we don't need it for the whole sentence. Let's prove it. I'm going to read this sentence without that little chunk. Hybrid cars now make up a significant share of the automotive market. That's fine. The sentence makes sense without that portion. That means we could separate it with a comma followed by another comma. The answer is C. So here's a very useful hint on the test. To determine if the middle portion of a sentence is needed, try jumping over it. This is a great way to see if you should be using commas. If a sentence still makes sense without a certain portion, then you're allowed to separate it with a comma on each side. Now here's a slight variation. The Zapatismo, a movement started by Emiliano Zapata, was one of the first great agrarian movements of the 20th century. You can give this one a try. Press pause and think about it. The question is if we have a chunk that we could remove. The answer is yes. Look at those words, a movement started by Emiliano Zapata. That's just a little extra information about the Zapatismo, but the sentence would make sense without it. Let's prove it. We'll read it without that portion. The Zapatismo was one of the first great agrarian movements of the 20th century. Totally fine. But look at what they're doing. They're starting that chunk with a dash. That means you have to end it with a dash. So the answer is J. So here's an extension of what we just saw. You can separate not essential information with a dash on each side, or you can separate not essential information with parentheses on each side. But the thing is, you have to stay consistent. You can't go comma dash or dash parentheses, Whatever you start with, you have to end with. And now comes a harder version of this rule. Here are two similar sentences. Think about if you would use commas to separate the person's name. One of my favorite playwrights, Adam Bach, likes to experiment with traditional structure. Playwright Adam Bach likes to experiment with traditional structure. Press pause and think about how commas might be used in each sentence here. Just like the last few examples, the big question is whether or not we can remove certain information. Let's read that first sentence without his name to see if it makes sense. One of my favorite playwrights likes to experiment with traditional structure. That's fine. It makes sense without his name. That means we're allowed to use commas on either side of his name. That would be fine. Let's try the second one without his name. Playwright likes to experiment with traditional structure. That doesn't make sense. We need his name in that sentence. That means that we can't use commas in sentence number 2. So this brings up a bit of a quirky detail. Sometimes a person's name or title is an essential part of the sentence. Other times, it's not. Again, try jumping over it. Read the sentence without that portion and just see if it flows. Let's try it on another. Announcer Howie Rose does an excellent job of describing the action from the booth. Press pause, give it a shot. The question is, do we need his name? Well, let's read it without. Announcer does an excellent job of describing the action from the booth. That doesn't make sense. We need his name. That means that we can't use commas to separate anything. It's fine the way it is. The answer is A. So, there's no hard and fast rule about how to separate a person's name. Sometimes it's information that you need. Other times, it's not. You have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Now, in my research for my curriculum, I have seen this topic appear under many different names. Different grammar books use different scary words. I've seen this called things like a restrictive versus a non-restrictive clause, an appositive, a modifying phrase, a noun phrase, or a restrictive versus non-restrictive element. And I've seen this come up under other fancy words as well. And I'm going to be completely honest with you all. I have no idea what any of those terms mean. Seriously. And now here's the fun part. It doesn't matter. I'm sure all of those terms mean something in the world of an English class, but for purposes of the SAT or the ACT, all you have to know is this. If the stuff can be removed, you can use punctuation to separate it. That's it. That's the only thing you need to know. As long as you can do that correctly, it doesn't matter what name you call it. Use commas when a sentence makes sense without that information in the middle. If the information needs to be there, then you can't use commas to separate it. It's as simple as that. Now we really get to the nitty-gritty. I'm going to give you a sentence that's grammatically correct. Think about why each comma here is being used correctly. After doing his research, Scott, a firm believer in fuel economy, decided to buy a hybrid car. Yes, it's another hybrid car question, but putting that aside, press pause for a moment and think about what each comma here is doing. It looks like those first two commas are separating the word Scott, but they're not. Let's get into it. That first comma is actually separating the introduction of the sentence. We don't need after doing his research. That's just a little intro. And that second comma is not separating the word Scott. It's separating the little bit about him, a firm believer in fuel economy. You can see that with the third comma. Let's prove it. I'm going to read this sentence without the introduction and without that little chunk that's describing Scott. Scott decided to buy a hybrid car. That's the sentence. The first comma is separating the introduction, and the other two are separating a firm believer in fuel economy. So this brings up an interesting point. Commas do not necessarily separate the words that they're closest to. Let's see how this looks on a question. Despite his alarm clock, Paul, unfortunately, slept through first period. Press pause, give it a shot. This is similar to the Scott question. It looks like those first two commas are separating the word Paul, but we need the word Paul. He's the subject doing the action. That first comma is actually separating the introduction. Despite his alarm clock is just a little intro that we don't need. And then that second comma is not separating the word Paul. It's starting to separate the word unfortunately. We don't need that word. Let's prove it. I'll read the sentence without the intro, and without the word unfortunately. Paul slept through first period. That's fine. That means we need another comma after the word unfortunately. The answer is J. That answer choice might look a little comma happy, so to speak. It appears as word, comma, word, comma, word, comma, but it's fine. Again, be super careful to identify which comma is doing what. Commas do not necessarily separate the words that they're closest to. Here's one more comma rule that occasionally makes an appearance on the test. Think about if you would insert commas between the underlined words in each sentence below. Connor said this grammar rule is completely unfair. Connor thought that this grammar rule was completely unfair. Give it a pause, give it a think. Both of these sentences introduce a phrase in quotes. However, there's an important difference. In the first one, we're dealing with dialogue. Connor's actually speaking. In the second one, it's narration. That means in the first one, we would use a comma before the quote, but in the second one, we wouldn't. So here's the rule. You do use a comma before a quote for dialogue. You don't use a comma before a quote for narration. Look out for words like said, declared, commented, remarked, anything that means that someone is speaking. And side note, this question is in no way based on a previous student named Connor. It is. So, as we said at the top, there are many points coming from comma usage. Just to recap everything we mentioned in this video, do not use a comma between two full thoughts. Think about where your brain wants to take a pause. You can use a comma between two adjectives if those adjectives can be flipped. You can also use commas to separate any information that can be cut from the sentence. You could also do this with dashes and parentheses. Also, be careful with a person's name or title. There's no hard and fast rule, it's a case-by-case scenario. Also, be careful to identify which comma is doing what. The commas don't necessarily separate the words that they're closest to. And only use commas for quotes before dialogue, but not for narration. These are very popular rules on both the SAT and the ACT. Now that we've talked about them, see if you can start to spot them on your practice tests. And keep it tuned right here. I'll be covering many other popular topics in the upcoming videos. Thanks, everyone. And remember, plan your work, work your plan.